We will start with Andrew Menard. He went to Georgetown and got his law degree from Harvard Law. Before we get into his radiology leadership experience, he has extensive experience with legal, nonprofit, board expertise, consulting experience, teaching experience, and healthcare entrepreneurial experience. His radiology leadership includes working at the Brigham, where he was director of business development and executive director. He's currently at Johns Hopkins. He was the chief administrator office, and now he is the executive director for radiology strategy and information. He works on critical areas such as implementing AI into clinical practice, development of a theranostics program, and as we talked about the shortage, he's trying to maintain academic excellence while meeting the demands of the current situation. He serves on RSNA's Committee for Governmental Relationships, and he's on multiple committees at Hopkins. Look at this. He's in radiology news here. He won the 2023 Mini for Most Effective Radiology Administrator / Manager. Incredible. I'm not going to read what AI has to say about him, but they did a pretty good job. And without further ado, we would start our first presentation.
Thank you so much, Ben. That's a great introduction. I want to start off actually by saying that it's funny to be here speaking and talking about regulation in a law firm, Nixon Peabody, a firm I know. But I'm not speaking as a lawyer or as a recovering attorney, which is really what I am. I'm speaking more in those other roles as an administrator of radiology, someone that's sort of actively working on implementing radiology, AI, not just in radiology at Johns Hopkins, but I'm part of a small group that has been implementing governance across the health system for all of the ologies and all of the departments, and spend a fair amount of time on all of these sorts of topics. So it's really kind of fun. I also just, as a fun thing, as we were waiting for this all to get started, there were some slides going up. There was like sort of a contact us slide, and it had a photo of a young, presumably radiologist, young physician who had their stethoscope around their neck and was holding a floppy piece of old film. And I just thought that was a funny sort of juxtaposition for talking now about AI. I wonder if that young radiologist could even make any sense of what that piece of film actually was. But it's kind of maybe that's a holdover or an intentional effort. It's presumably, is it okay if I go ahead and start sharing my slides?
Please do.
All right. So hopefully you're all seeing these slides now, and I'm going to sort of run through, and as I said, talk a little bit about the regulation of AI in the United States. So the first thing I want to do in that regard is just make sure we're all talking about some of the same things. AI comes in lots of different flavors, in our world, and it goes through this thing. I made a little sort of ice cream cone for those flavors. Device embedded AI, and there might be more there. We are all sort of using DLR, or deep learning recognition, for things like MRI and CT, and it accelerates as part of the operating system of those systems. There could be, though, a more interesting future for some of that type of AI, triage AI, image analysis AI that's more than triage, report generation AI, workflow automation. So all of these things, these major domains, they all have aspects that are regulatory. They all present challenges, both from a regulatory and ethical perspective. And some of the things that I'm going to hopefully introduce to you now really sort of touch on all of them. A lot of focus goes to the sort of image analysis AI, but it really applies in all of these different flavors. I also meant to say, by the way, I'm sorry I'm not there in person. This would be a lot more fun for me to be able to interact with all of you all in person, but something came up and I wasn't able to be there, so I'm sorry to have to do this virtual. Anyway, let's do some level setting to begin with. And the first thing is, let's presume that the regulators are working in good faith and that the regulations are not intended to benefit any special interests. There's, some people argue that's not necessarily the case, and we might touch on a couple of examples where we see some conflicts. But we're really guiding towards, let's presume everybody is pushing for the safe, responsible, and ethical and legally compliant development, deployment, and clinical use of AI here in healthcare. And there's great, reasons that were on your prior slides. We need it because we're never going to have enough physicians to, interpret all the exams. We're never going to have enough physicians to take care of our patients and other clinicians, but physicians are the key value drivers. So I think it's appropriate to really focus on, can AI responsibly deployed help us with the radiologist shortage in this case? The other thing, of course, I'll go through is to just remind you all from your sort of high school civics that we have a multi-layered approach in the United States. So federal, state, local, and I'm going to add on just at the end a bit of the non-governmental, if you can call it regulation, attempt to regulate or to capture regulatory authority that we see some jockeying going on in society right now. Another distinction that I want to help you make and understand is that the regulatory burden is often not, it's conflated sometimes. People think of some of the regulations sort of improperly, because there are regulations that really apply to the developers and marketers of AI products. And if you're in R&D, if you're at an academic center and you're sort of building AI and you want to train and make your own products, it'd be important for you to understand those rules as well. But most physicians are providers out taking care of patients. And there's a different set of regulations that they really need to be more focused on. But they still need to be, I think, literate and understand what for very different reasons, why you need to understand the ones that affect the developers. But you have to be cognizant of the ones that apply to you in the actual real world. So there's, two different regulatory burdens. The reason I have the folks pointing at each other here is that the industry side has been trying to shift some of the burden onto the provider side through some not particularly subtle efforts. And we can talk about those. Hopefully, that's another topic that's more fun in person, but we'll see if we can talk about some of those too. So I want to start with the federal regulation of AI. So on this graphic, I included really the major sources of federal regulation. The two on the right of the slide, so CMS and HHS, those are the ones that are most relevant to providers. The FDA and the White House are the ones that are most relevant to developers and marketers of AI tools. As I said, I think it's important you understand both categories. And my reason for that is I want to continue to encourage your skepticism as you consider and deal with the outputs of AI, and understanding what the marketers are doing, what the companies that are producing the tools are doing, will help you sort of maintain that skepticism, I think. In the interest of focus, however, I'm going to cancel out CMS. It's a topic that I like, but it's less relevant perhaps for today. CMS chooses to pay for some tools, some AI tools, and this is to encourage its use. If you're using any of the FFR, was it a functional flow reserve CT tools for heart analysis, for example, those are things that the CMS wants people to use because they feel it's better for patients, but it's really better for how much money they have to spend. They avoid diagnostic or invasive diagnostic tests by using those kind of tools. However, and they keep adding 3 or 4 new tools each year in their rulemaking to list what they pay for. I argue that this distorts clinical behavior, and it's also unnecessary to get the desired result. And that's kind of another talk, but it's one that I'm interested in, but I'm going to skip today. So I will start with the federal regulation that comes from the FDA and introduce you to that just very briefly. And I hope a lot of this, by the way, is going to be familiar to you from not necessarily from AI world, but you'll see that it's the same. In this case, it's going to be the same framework that we use for medical devices. So I hope all the physicians are somewhat familiar with how the FDA regulates medical devices. And how do they do it? They regulate the marketing and sale and commerce of these devices. And that's because of the original law, the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, which I'll come back to briefly in the future. This regulates how you can introduce products into commerce, and if the AI tool is intended to diagnose, treat, mitigate, and prevent disease, the FDA has taken the position that it becomes a medical device. This is the famous software as a medical device. There's also something software in a medical device, which is also regulated, and I'm going to touch on that maybe a little bit later on as well. And the approach taken by the FDA should also be familiar to you. And this is the idea of a risk-based framework. And they differentiate between low-risk tools that may not require FDA oversight, and moderate or high-risk tools that typically do require some pre-market review. And I'm going to go through the main categories on the next slide, but you should have a general understanding of these, again, for that skepticism preservation that I mentioned. So what are the main pathways? And hopefully all of these are familiar, and you recognize them from medical devices, like your imaging scanners themselves, because these are the same categories. A key thing that I want to point out, just a key word on here that people misuse all the time, and it bothers me. This could be the former lawyer in me. Clearance versus approval. They're very different, and they have very different connotations for what it really means. Clearance is simply substantial equivalent to something that's already on the marketplace. So AI is using that 510K pathway most frequently. And that means the predicate can be something else that's on the market. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be software. It can be, what you are deemed to have as your predicate, what you're able to use, could be a physical device. You use a tongue depressor or something. And it's a very low burden. And the FDA has very few tools that they can use in their statutory authority. And then you have a de novo pathway. These are for, say, lower risk but moderate risk, lower to moderate risk, and then finally PMA. And the difference among these things are how much work you have to do to get it approved, how rigorous that work is. I would say even a PMA is nowhere near as rigorous as what you may think about when you think of FDA approval, because normally that word conjures up the work that goes on in the pharmaceutical field. And drugs go through, very rigorous testing. You're familiar with the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and all of the, the other components of, say, drug approvals. And a PMA is not that. PMA is much easier than an NDA. But PMA is incredibly more difficult than, say, a 510K, which is almost nothing. I want to pause for a second on de novo, because I sort of hinted at this a little bit earlier. For software in a medical device, one of the hot topics in some of the circles that I'm in right now is whether there is a pathway that would allow for autonomous AI to be deployed in clinical settings. And this would be autonomous. This would be AI where there's no physician in the loop, no human in the loop, and some argument that there is no way under the current FDA structures to allow that. But that may not actually be the case. There was a recent de novo pathway application that the FDA has cleared, and the company is called Luminetics. It's not in our space. It's diabetic retinopathy. But there they have a screening device with AI built into it. And they got it through the de novo pathway with a pretty low burden, 900 patients. And it was actually a patient population that was intentionally enriched with patients that were at high risk for a diabetic retinopathy, but only 900. And they showed 87% sensitivity, 89% specificity. And their output was a binary output, meaning, yes or no was the only output from the device. Operators were intentionally not skilled. They describe, and interestingly, how you take your medical support staff, and they get 1 hour of training to use the device, and they used it, and they got still this sensitivity specificity. Presumably that would go up with greater expertise, but the actionable step is one of the things that made it low risk. The actionable step is if you get a positive from that device, you get referred by a, say, a primary care provider, they call it a frontline provider, to an ophthalmologist who then determines what happens next. So there isn't much of a care pathway other than a referral. But I still like that because this is a concrete example of something that got through the FDA, and you can find very easily, or I can send you what the what their approval was, what testing they did. It really wasn't very burdensome, but it's still much better than what we see on 510K. And the reason it's relevant to radiology is I've already been in some discussions with some of the big device makers, where they're considering whether there are situations where they can use some of their device-embedded AI for autonomous uses like this, for some binary determinations. And that could be something that either helps or hurts radiology, depending on how you look at it. But it might relieve some of the workload. We have to figure out how to address those things, how to put them into sort of workflow. But it's an interesting area to somebody like me. Now I want to talk a little bit about the approach that went in place prior to the Trump administration, prior to this last election. And the AI presented a real problem to the FDA. And the problem is that they learn over time. And the frameworks that the FDA has to operate under really couldn't accommodate that. And yet they wanted to, find ways to permit AI to be used clinically because of all the benefits that you've heard about. So they started to develop and publish guidance for manufacturers, although a fair amount of the steps that are in this guidance leads over into what providers have to do. And the manufacturers, of course, were pushing that further and further into your responsibility for how you go forward. Real world monitoring, for example. How is that going to be done? I'm not gonna go through. I actually had other talks that are really, really boring, that go through sort of the details of what were in some of those things. I may show one little chart from one of them, but how does that really work? How does that fit, despite these efforts, in our real world environment? And I think this slide, I don't need to say very much. I put 2 dates in red. So all of the regulations, the statutory authority, comes from the Medical Device Amendments of 1976 to a 1938 law. And 1976 might as well be 1776. There's just no way that you can accommodate what's going on right now, particularly as we shift over towards generative AI, into the 1976 frameworks that they do there. And the FDA knows that their pathways don't fit, and so they come up with voluntary guidance, but their guidance is very burdensome. Acknowledging this to some degree, there's an RFI that's outstanding right now. I think the due date for responses is December 1st. And the FDA is asking the public, you all, to tell them how you are monitoring drift in AI models in the real world following your clinical implementation. And this is a really difficult topic to do. I attended a lecture last week by Dr. Michael Oberst, who's a visiting researcher at GHU, on the state of AI monitoring. And my characterization, I suppose, of his lecture is the current efforts to evaluate these tools, particularly to evaluate generative AI tools like clinical summaries and notes, are not encouraging. Both the value of the tools, their accuracy of the tools leaves open lots of questions, and the value of the monitoring tools are not there. There's some commercial vendors. The only one I know of that's making sort of a credible case is AI Doc for monitoring the real world, and that's because of their work with Nina Kotler and the radiology partners, who have such a big data set that maybe they can come up with some approaches. But we're really not monitoring, and that's one of the major things that the FDA has put into their guidance, where as a voluntary requirement. It's kind of a oxymoron. So why is it so difficult? Well, software as a medical device is really a poor fit for for AI. You've probably heard there's, I think, 1,016 last count, FDA cleared tools, most of which are in imaging, most of which are single point solutions, and most of which are worthless. And this in part is because everybody is using the 510K clearance, and 510K clearance is the low bar. Now, when I say they're worthless, there's a few different reasons for that, but the big one is they're not practicable. You can't implement them in a meaningful workflow that can actually help the radiologist do their job. And that's where some focus, and if you're thinking about clinical implementation, think about your workflow, think about what you're trying to do. You're trying to make life better. You're trying to make the day better for your radiologist. Things like productivity, those are just side effects. So you will get those if you can come up with a workflow that actually addresses, the needs of your physicians. But the applications that have been, going through the FDA and gotten cleared over the last, say, even some of them are even more than 3 years old, really don't do that at all. And there's no way to make them do that. And that's why I call them worthless. The other elements I would mention is that what I already said about sort of frozen systems. And even with PCCP updates, that just doesn't do the job. And that's because the advances in AI, you've probably seen them, they're rapid and they're multidimensional. And a planned control for updating these things, predetermined change control plan, that really is not going to be able to capture things that you can't anticipate. They're changing so fast, particularly again in the LLM world. But that'll be very quickly bleeding into what we do. The days of having generative AI, foundation models for radiology are coming. The FDA has already designated the ADOC foundation model, radiology foundation model. It's based on CT only, but that CT, it's been given breakthrough status and an expedited review. So we're going to start to see these foundation models, and there's just all of these things under software as a medical device. Those voluntary guidance, they go out the window. They really just can't do the job. So let's turn to something that's actually a little bit more directly relevant to you all. And these are regulations that come out from the Health and Human Services. And those are things that aren't necessarily specifically about AI, but have applicability to AI, and have applicability to your work as you do things. So first of all, I'll focus on HIPAA, and then I'll talk about the ONC or ONSHA and their rules. Just two parts of HHS. There are some others, but these are going to be the main ones. And as you probably know, HIPAA is a broad statute. It has lots of division, lots of requirements, but we can focus on just a few so you see how this applies to your work with AI. Well, first of all, of course, that the AI models require large data sets to be trained, and it's it's PHI. HIPAA has 18 different identifiers that have to be removed to make it de-identified. And I think there's a nice topic. David Larson from Stanford wrote an article about de-identified aggregated data as a public good, laying sort of the foundation for saying we actually have both the ability and the obligation to use this data to make life better for people. And that's a nice foundation, but you have to comply with HIPAA anyway. So you have to really be looking at those things. And the big problem under HIPAA is something called data minimization. So you have developers have to make sure they use only the minimum possible PHI for training and for testing of a tool. So that's a HIPAA requirement that really doesn't fit AI, because AI works best when you have massive data, or even you have completely comprehensive data, like all data on all patients, that kind of thing. So it doesn't fit well within HIPAA, and yet HIPAA is the law of the land. HIPAA has other things like the HIPAA security rule, things that mandate technical, administrative, and physical safeguards for PHI. So this means, for example, secure data storage, encrypted transfer for training and inference data, all kinds of access controls, audit trails. All of those things still apply in the world of AI, and all of those things are going to give heartburn to your IT administrators within your organization. Of course, if an AI vendor or a cloud provider, say, are using an AI tool, And you right now, most of the AI tools run in the cloud, someone's cloud. You're going to need BAAs, business associate agreements, because they have to agree to comply with the HIPAA rules as if they were you. So, that's going to be part of this, and that regulates it. To some degree, it helps protect you and shift burden, but you'll find some clever legal tactics that are used by the vendors to sort of minimize their exposure to all these things. There are issues about patient privacy and transparency that apply across the board, applies to you, applies to the vendors. You still have to look at that as you're doing whatever you're doing in AI. And there's the issue of AI generated outputs. We've been having a lot of discussion about that at Johns Hopkins right now, about what does that really mean? It becomes part of the medical record. How do we save them? And if it's linked to individuals, of course, it's PHI, but there's also other sort of specific things in there. And the bonus that got everybody kind of worked up a year or two ago was a statement by the Office of Civil Rights within HHS. This was under the Biden administration, that pointed out to folks that the ACA Section 1557, not the non-discrimination rule, applies to AI. And they said they want you to demonstrate that your development and use of AI doesn't somehow violate this non-discrimination rule. I went to a talk by the head of the Office of Civil Rights saying, no, it's nothing new. It's what you've always had to do. But it certainly scared folks as to how do we actually establish that? How do we prove that? But that's all just part of the background law that's always applied to you. It's just good to realize that this is just a new wrinkle in how you have to comply with these rules. The Office of the National Coordinator is maybe a little bit more directly focused on AI. Although I want to point out that they're talking about certified health IT, and they want to encourage people to get certification and get accreditation. But does that make sense? Your EHR is going to start. Remember the meaningful use project? When everyone had to get sort of comply with standards. This is the same office, the same kind of things, but it isn't as mandatory at this point, particularly under the current administration. But they're implementing standards for algorithm transparency. That's easier said than done. Predictive decision support. So these kind of DSI interventions, predictive DSIs, and there you're supposed to be able to have source attributes. And you should be clear on what's the intended population, what's the development methodology, all the things that also sort of show up in some of the FDA voluntary guidance. Here it might be a little bit less voluntary, but it's also not clear to me sort of who this really applies to as far as what's required versus, again, what is sort of voluntary. They also create their own responsible AI use framework. Theirs is called FAVES. They have a pretty good acronym. There's lots of those out there, and there's really not a standard. Hopkins developed its own. We have 7 principles that we're supposed to be complying with as we go through. CHI has theirs, and other people have theirs, but we haven't really agreed on all of those things. There are some resources though that the ONC points to. And there are some things from NIST that are useful. And for example, they have a glossary that's always updated. So if you want to keep up with terms as they're coming through, NIST is a nice thing to have just a link on your browser if you use browsers anymore. They have the interoperability rules, some real world testing rules, all kinds of things that are coming out of the White House. And most of those, or many of those, were again developed under the Biden administration. And it sort of sets up the next section, because we really had a major change when the Trump administration came to town. So now I'm going to talk about the White House and what they're saying about health AI specifically. And as I mentioned, it was a big about face, a big change in direction. As soon as the day one, when the Trump administration came in, they issued an executive order that rescinded the Biden era executive order. I think there's actually more than one executive order, but they characterized them as hindering AI innovation and imposing onerous and unnecessary government controls over AI. And they instructed all of the agencies, so not just in healthcare, to actually go and rescind all the regulations and orders and things that they had taken. And a better way of understanding that, I thought, was kind of contemporaneously in February of 2025, former FDA chief, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, published a viewpoint in JAMA. And what he said was that the current regulatory posture of the FDA, that was the one that was, when he was writing that was under Biden, could impede or block the integration of AI tools into EMR systems. He says there was a risk that EMR developers would attempt to circumvent the uncertainty by simply omitting the features, and that this could deny healthcare clinicians access to AI tools that have the potential to transform productivity and safety in medical care. So that, that was a way of really explaining to the House of Medicine what the administration was talking about. Of course, Dr. Gottlieb at that point was no longer in the government, but his points were reinforced a couple weeks later by Vice President Vance, who went over to the AI Action Summit in Europe. And he kind of lectured the attendees in Paris about, their misguided views of AI. And here's some of the main things that he said. He said that, the U.S. is going to focus on AI opportunity rather than AI risk. And they're going to take a deregulatory approach towards AI. And they didn't like the precautionary regulatory model that and by the way, in their defense, if you were to read some of the long executive orders that came out of the Biden administration, they're just full of fear. It's all about everything that can go wrong. And it was an attempt to sort of slow down something that really wasn't going to be slowed down. And under the Trump administration, they explicitly say they want to foster innovation rather than strangling it. So it was a big break, and I think it actually makes sense for at least two major reasons. First, AI is evolving too fast for the deliberate and glacial pace of government regulation. You don't have to read too much in the sort of AI news to see that the new reasoning models were just leapfrogging each other every few weeks. Something that is cutting edge is only cutting edge for a few weeks. And one size just does not fit all. And so we have to have the flexibility to tailor tools to particular local needs within healthcare. And second is a more general concern I have about sort of the growth of administrative overhang in healthcare that makes our costs so high and actually puts extra burden on our physicians. And that is government regulation by its nature emphasizes process over outcomes. And we tend to create more and more mandatory processes, and these things pile up. It imposes that administrative burden on providers, and we end up losing sight of the outcomes we're trying to improve. So I'm going to go back to one of the voluntary guidance things just to sort of drive that point home. So in the AI lifecycle guidance, as one of the three major documents, this slide, as complicated as it is, which tells you the steps that you should be considering and having separate plans for. This is actually a summary of 128 separate steps that they recommend for healthcare vendors and healthcare providers. 128 steps. So to summarize them, they get this maybe about 60 or so of them actually in boxes on this thing. Who could possibly comply with all these things and get any clinical benefit out of AI? You'll spend all your time just with compliance. So there's some reason, some justification for re-looking at the path we were on if we actually want to get benefit out of AI. So here's one of the things that is important. In July, they issued the White House AI Action Plan, and again in there's a lot of things that I kind of like, but I had to give a lecture recently on sort of the ethical impact of some of these changes, and so I decided to throw some of those on these slides so you won't see just what is coming out of that action plan, and you think about what the cost of it is going to be. So some of it, for example, there's a fixation on DEI for some reason within the Trump administration, and they want to remove all those regulations, web content from the agencies. They want to change some of the language, words you can even use in some of the work that you're doing. All of that stuff, the diversity guides for trials has to be removed. And they're looking for LLM providers to be ideologically neutral, whatever that means. But from if you're looking at machine learning, or even with LLMs, you're risking sort of damaging the data set. We have to be able to understand what's happening to subgroups, and the scientific validity and the risks, of bias, for example, go up if we have less granular data. So eliminating any of these fields will undermine sort of the scientific validity, as well as, I'd like to cite, John Rawls. That's because I'm old, and John Rawls was still an important philosopher when I was at Harvard. He was teaching there. But this is the idea of justice as fairness, and there's a framework that one can use in order to sort of evaluate justice in that type of an ethical setting. And some of these rules, so DEI helps with the integrity of data, but it also helps with some of those types of things. And so if you're concerned about ethics, they probably have gone too far with what they're trying to get out of there. There's a lot more on that plan, but it's not that long of a plan. And this is a good opportunity to use, say, ChatGPT and go and sort of get a summary of that plan geared towards whatever your interests are. So I encourage you to have a look at that plan. Now, and let me just check on my time here a second too. 8:46. Yeah, I've kind of gone longer than I expected to go. So I'm going to spend very little time on the state and local, but this is somewhat similar to the talk that I gave sort of on HIPAA. You have to look at the laws that are applying to you now, even if it's not specifically been adapted or there's been nothing added to it for AI, they still apply to you. So what I did was I took some of the major parts of sort of New York healthcare law and say, what does this mean from an AI context? So for licensure, professional conduct, the physician is still going to remain accountable. The human in the loop is going to be you, and you're going to be on the hook for the clinical decisions that are made with the outputs of the AI. You still have to do everything that you have to do as far as records go, the services you deliver, the quality assurance, they apply to the AI tools just like they apply to a physical tool. You have still the supervision responsibilities, credentialing, the scope of practice responsibilities. So that's going to be covered also by your statute. And I already mentioned cybersecurity and risk assessment. These all apply, and this just creates more work for your IT people. Patient records presents some new issues. It applies. So whatever you have, but the position we're taking is if AI outputs influence care, then they're part of the medical record, and they have to be discoverable by the patient. They have to be available to the patient. Does that mean they have to be in my chart if you're using Epic? I'm not so sure of that. And I think, in fact, there's a framework for when they do and when they do not, because some really are going to be meaningless. You have to have written policies, and what that means isn't entirely clear. In New York, you have some special things. The SHIELD Act, I was trying to understand that, but the patient has a right to get those outputs, and just under that rule, if you agree that these outputs are part of what's guiding care, the patient has a right to get them, and there's short periods of time. There are breach response requirements and safeguards. There's lots of specific stuff there. And then I'll finish it up with just saying that there's all the special protections. These other things still apply with respect to AI as well. And if you're participating in like an HEI, a health information exchange, we do in Maryland as well. The idea of the implication of those things for me are mostly for training and development of AI, and you can't pool yourself simply by putting your data into one of those exchanges. So the last thing in my last slide is to say that capitalism abhors a vacuum, and the restraint by the White House, self-restraint for taking a deregulatory approach, has created opportunities for regulatory capture. And I'm not sure if you know that phrase, but the one I want to cite in particular because I was, at the meetings when these things were being discussed and developed, and I'm very unhappy with, is that in September, the Coalition for Healthcare AI, CHI, published their guidance for providers on the adoption of clinical AI. And I think their guidance is both impracticable and sort of rife with conflicts of interest. So it's an effort by the Joint Commission working, in partnership, as they said, with CHI to fill that vacuum. It's a power grab in my view, and CHI ignored objections raised by the founding members. Hopkins is one of the founding members on issuing this guidance. And it's another case where I have to say I agree with the Trump administration. So the Jim O'Neill, who's the deputy HHS secretary, published or was interviewed by Politico, and his line was here, this is not your cartel. And he says, you don't speak for us, and that this is just an attempt at regulatory capture at some big companies to really set the rules and maybe squeeze out other ones. Interestingly, at the same meeting where the Joint Commission convenes some meetings occasionally on this topic of AI, and for some reason they invite me to those meetings. And at the same meeting where they were announcing the CHI partnership, they also had the CEO of Palantir announcing the partnership with Palantir. And those two back to back at the same sort of discussion session really kind of made me uneasy. And I think that they're not unrelated. So a lot of opportunity for Palantir to increase its data acquisition for whatever its plans are. And as you know, they've got access to all the Social Security data and all the Defense Department data and stuff like that as well now. So that's kind of the end of my talk, and I hope that we're going to have a chance to ask and answer questions and get people actually discussing stuff.